Hi everyone. I have with me Professor Eugene Rogan from Oxford University. He teaches there, and I believe he's talking live from Oxford right now. He's professor in Middle East history, and he's written some really great books on Ottoman and Middle Eastern history. The other one that's I think slightly more famous and could be found at one point in every store in Lahore was at the Arabs History. I remember seeing it and I'm like, yeah, I think I'll finish the first one and then buy it. In the end, I had to buy it on a Kindle because obviously they just ran out of books. So, welcome, Professor, and let's get started. We'll be talking today about the Ottomans, the history of the First World War, the present state of the Middle East, Turkey, the Arab countries, etc. So just feel free to ask questions, everyone, and we will just start talking with Professor Rogan, with Eugene. And let's just ask him. I wanted to know, how did you come about having such an interest in history and especially in this region?
Maria,
Where did you?
first, let me say how grateful I am for the invitation. It's wonderful to be back with the Lahore Literary Festival. I only wish I was with you in Lahore, but
Yeah,
beaming live here from Oxford, it's great to be with you.
yeah,
And how did I get to study the history of the Middle East? It's life experience more than anything else, really. I was taken to Beirut as a child with my family. We moved
uh-huh.
there when I was 10 years old. And I lived 5 years in Beirut through Arab-Israeli wars in 1973, through the outbreak of the Lebanese civil war, at which point
That's
we left Beirut to go to Cairo. And I was there for 3 years through Sadat's presidency, his trip to Jerusalem to speak to the Israeli people, and the whole launching of the Egyptian-Israeli peace process. I think those 8 years in high school branded me as a with a fascination for the Middle East that I've never lost. I mean, here I am.
yeah. So you studied history at Harvard, right?
I actually started as an economist at Columbia, and I think
Yeah,
that's
I
the
saw.
second thing.
I saw exactly, exactly. So, did that lead to your interest in history as well?
Yes, I think I'm a refugee to history. From a failed economist, I took refuge in history.
No, I'm sure you would have been really great at economics as well. No, and I remember reading in this book about your own personal connection with the experience of. Of the British people in the First World War in this entire region through, I think, your great uncle.
That's correct. And
I
so, I
know, and
mean,
I've,
there is a sense.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. No, no, of
You
course,
guys say?
continue, continue.
No, I mean, in
Go.
that sense, there is a strong personal connection. And my great uncle, my mother's uncle,
Yeah, yeah.
was 19-year-old who volunteered for the First World War, thinking he'd go and fight in France, and found
Oh,
himself on a ship in Turkey, which was as far from his native Scotland as you could wildly imagine.
yeah, of course, of
And
course.
he died within weeks of arrival there, and we went to visit his grave, and it was such a learning experience for me because I'd had in growing up all my family's stories about how
Yeah, yeah,
his death had precipitated my Scottish family's move to America. And
yeah,
I had no idea really about the Ottoman side of that story. And I think the genesis of my book, The Fall of the Ottomans, lay in that visit to his grave
uh-huh.
95 years after he had
Yeah,
died,
yeah,
and realizing that there was a whole Ottoman side of that tragedy that I didn't know. And I
yeah.
thought perhaps many Western readers didn't know either.
Yeah. No, and honestly, I find it fascinating, with this, with a lot of current historians writing currently. For example, Philippe Sand's book on the genocide, East West Street, like it started from his own personal experience, finding that box of his grandfather's pictures, etc., and then taking it back to the word genocide and the history of the Second World War. So I find that very fascinating, taking personal history and using that as a lens to see other people's experiences. And I found that fascinating about your book, The Arabs, as well, where you've taken writings by not mainstream authors but people's diaries, and using those to see what it was like for common people. And I think you've done that in this book as well. Doesn't that
It's
entail a
always
lot of, how do you even find those sources? Because like with archives, etc., because I've seen that especially in my part of the world, it's very hard to come across well kept archives, and even harder honestly to access them, given sometimes government restrictions, sometimes personal people's files, etc. So how do you find the process of going through all of these sources?
Well, I mean, I'm a great lover of both archives and libraries. And I think my first answer is let us sing the praises of librarians and archivists for preserving for
I love,
civilization just
I
those
love,
kinds of accounts. They're they're worth their weight in gold to the historian because they give you the immediacy of seeing history through the eyes of someone who lived through the events. And for me as a
yeah,
historian, it makes it
yeah.
so much more real, so much more immediate.
And I think more
So
truthful as well, maybe, right? Because all of these grand narratives written from some sort of, maybe some sort of agenda or some sort of preconceived notions, I think diaries or letters might, give you more of an immediacy and more of a truthful picture, even if it's, partial. Obviously it's personal, but I think it might give you a more truthful version of events as they appeared to people on the ground, maybe.
you're going to always get a wide range of sources to write history so that you don't become too dependent on the worldview of just one source. Because all
Exactly.
sources come with their baggage and with their biases. And
Exactly.
so, but still, I agree with you. I think there's something very honest about that first person account that was reflective of its time and
Yeah.
is a window for us to visit that strange land that is the past.
True, true. No, and I find that honestly, like let's talk a little bit about the Ottomans. Honestly speaking, they are a topic of much conversation now, given these Turkish dramas, especially based on historical figures, etc. Because I think they're showing Ertugrul nowadays. Then they had Suleiman the Magnificent. A lot of these disease, as they call them in Turkey, based on Ottoman sultans, etc. So especially in Pakistan right now as well, there's a lot of fascination with the subject. So I think you skipped that part and moved right to where they start falling. So maybe not as glamorous, but still obviously this is worth studying as well. So why did you skip all of those very fascinating parts and come to this one?
It's true. I can't see anybody making soap operas out of the experiences of soldiers in the trenches in World War One,
Oh,
for
there
one
are some
thing.
very great movies, but yes, no soap operas.
No, not soap opera. The costume is just not as glamorous. You're right. And
True.
look, I love all periods of Ottoman history. As a reader, I
Yeah, yeah,
find that if you go to the 17th, 18th century, that whole world of Islamic empires, which gives you the Ottomans, the Safavids, and of course the Mughals, and the way
yeah.
in which they
Oh,
exchange cultural influences, the way miniature painting passes from South Asia through Persia
yeah,
to the Ottoman world,
yeah.
food,
Yeah,
algebra,
true,
astronomy.
true.
Visiting the astronomical park in Lahore was such a revelation for me. And it
Yeah,
was exactly that period of the sort of 17th, 18th century when I think the
exactly.
great scientific breakthroughs were going on in Islamic empires before the
True,
European Enlightenment
true.
shifted the center of gravity of discovery.
Exactly, exactly. And honestly speaking, I think there's, especially like from what I hear over here, so there's like a lot of talk about the lost Islamic civilizations, etc. But honestly speaking, especially even if you look at curriculums, school history books, whether it's here, whether it's in England, honestly they present a very small, very partial, and askew sort of lopsided view of history. Even though there's this general narrative that the Islamic civilization was very rich, I don't think people really know the details of what it was like. And
Well,
honestly, even with the history of the First World War, I remember in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, we used to have world history before it became completely history of Pakistan and India. And I remember reading about the First and the Second World War, but there wasn't a lot of attention paid to the Ottomans, only as briefly mentioned allies of the Germans when they entered the First World War. So there is that as well,
but I
honestly. And
think we historians are under pressure now to change the way we write history and to write a far more global and inclusive history and to decolonize our history. I mean, the
oh,
pressure
exactly.
on Western European
Yeah,
and American universities to
yeah,
really rethink the emphases and the priorities we put in the history we teach or what goes into our school curriculums is really being contested now in a very positive way. And for historians who work on non-European parts of the world, Africa, Latin America, Asia, Middle East, it's a very exciting time. I think we have a broader audience now for the work
Yeah,
we're doing, and the history we do is more relevant than ever.
exactly. And especially, I remember with the Lahore Literary Festival, I think every year there is a lot of attention paid to historians, especially working on this region, like this
Right.
region or maybe the global south in general. But do you find that with this writing of history, with obviously you're a professor, I think you do take supervisions of PhD students as well.
I
So do
do.
you find, students, I might be one of those candidates, maybe, like 10 years down the line, who knows? Yeah, exactly.
You're
So I
welcome.
consider that a formal offer. I'm going to consider that a formal offer from
I'll put
Oxford.
it in writing.
Yeah, great. So, and like, do you find with your students, are there still, maybe Anglo-Saxon students focusing on these areas, or do you find indigenous students taking an interest as well?
Well,
People from Pakistan wanting to write about, Pakistan's history, etc. Do you find that, maybe they're increasing, and how much of an influence do you think there is in their writings as far as publication or, like general recognizability is concerned?
no, I think, again, this is one of the things that's really exciting about histories of the global South, is that our universities are not only attracting students from our countries, so we get a lot of British students here, American
Yeah,
students here, but
yeah,
also from the region, also from the rest of the global South. We have
yeah.
students coming to study with us from Pakistan and India, from China and Japan, as well as Europe, the Middle East, and America. And so I think in that sense, it's a meeting ground. The moment you leave a focus on Nazis and Tudors and start
Yeah,
looking at Latin American or
true,
African or Middle Eastern history, then I
true.
think it's something which engages a much broader student body as of interest and of relevance to their concerns.
Yeah, true, true. So, what kind of concerns are they focusing on?
Well, I mean, I
Like,
think that there's been a real emphasis on trying to break from colonial history, from elite history, as a real drive to gender our work, to diversify our work, and the
yeah,
kind of topics that our students bring that they want to do research on are
mhm.
taking them into environmental history, into medical history,
That's
into some subaltern histories. So, there are whole new chapters waiting to be written from new sources. And, those are the positive and exciting things. The
yeah,
downside is for those who want to study the Middle East, the conflicts in the region of the past 10 years have
yeah. I
closed
was
more and more of the region to our students. And it becomes very hard to do the field work that was
true,
normal for someone of my generation to do.
of course. And what do you think the impact has been, especially with the ISIS wars and with the Arab Spring, etc.? What's the impact been on sources? Matlab, with the museums, etc., and other archives.
We have
What?
instances of the destruction of archives and libraries as a result of conflict. And the most obvious example was in 2003 with the destruction of the Baghdad National Library and archives. So,
Yeah,
we can point to clear examples where conflict has destroyed the historic record,
true.
though we see it as a second order priority to the human suffering and loss that these
Yeah,
wars and conflicts have entailed. But beyond that, Madiha, I think it's also the ways in which the governments and societies in Middle Eastern countries have come to be suspicious of foreign researchers, seeing us
true.
either as spies or else as agitators who are trying to provoke Arab Spring revolts and encourage resistance or opposition to government. And so
And
we've
this was
seen,
the attitude before the Arab Spring as well, or generally afterwards?
I think there's been a real change since the Arab Spring because
Okay.
governments have become very repressive again in trying to assert their authority, and they are more concerned about the influence of foreigners and more nativist in their politics, which has added challenges to us doing field work where we've had students killed. Um, there's a Cambridge doctoral student who was murdered in Egypt. We've had students arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment for espionage. This happened in the United Arab Emirates.
Yeah.
And we've had students who have been barred from entering countries or expelled from countries for doing their research. So it's a tough time for our students to do their work.
It is. Of course it is. No, and it must be very difficult for teachers as well.
No, it is.
Yeah, of course. So what do you think like about the Ottomans, etc.? You've spent a lot of time describing the military conflicts, etc. And I found it fascinating what you wrote about how the Arabs, because for a major part of the book, I think there wasn't really any mention of Arabs fomenting, some sort of revolution to the point where Lawrence of Arabia comes in. It seems like a very outside sort of bet, and then suddenly everything changes. So, do you think that this would have happened anyway, with the kind of nationalism that had the nation state had started, becoming a major fact since the late 19th century? Or do you think that, outside forces had something to do in a major way in fomenting this or making this happen?
Well, I think the first thing to observe is in the Ottoman Empire, it was forbidden to talk nationalist politics. The Ottomans were very sensitive to this because of the experience of the Balkans, where nationalism emerged, particularly among Christian communities, and led to separatist movements in Greece and Bulgaria and Serbia and so on. And they
Yeah,
didn't want that happening in the Arab provinces.
yeah,
So there hadn't been time for ideologues to meet in groups and talk about political ideas that might lead to separatist movements. And
true.
World War One, I think it was really outside influences pushing the
Yeah,
Arab people to turn against the Ottomans as a way of provoking a kind of inside front to weaken the Ottoman Empire in
yeah,
their war with Germany. So
yeah,
Britain was really looking for ways to try and use an Arab revolt in some ways to compensate for defeats they'd suffered in Gallipoli to the Ottomans and in Mesopotamia in Kut al Amara, where again they surrender an army to the Ottoman forces. They didn't want to put
yeah.
more troops in the field and hope the Sharifs of Mecca, through creating a revolt inside the Ottoman Empire, might help precipitate its fall from within. So I think outside agency is really important there.
And why do you think, like, I found this, like a question coming up, that given that the Arabs were, one ethnicity, how come it ended up fracturing into so many different states instead of maybe, one Turkish state and one Arab state?
Well, I think that the one Arab state was very much what the Sharifs of Mecca, in their
Hmm.
negotiations with the British before launching their revolt, had hoped to secure. They talked
Yeah.
about an Arab kingdom or a confederation of Arab kingdoms, which would be under the different sons of Sharif Hussein of Mecca.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
that was their vision, and it comes from Islamic history, where the great Arab states had been empires, the Umayyads based in Damascus
Yeah.
or the Abbasids in Baghdad, ruling over the whole expanse of the Arabic speaking lands.
Yeah.
But it was, again, foreign intervention where Britain and its allies divided these Ottoman Arab territories among themselves as
Yeah.
war prizes in the event that they were victorious in the Great War.
True.
So the wartime partition diplomacy really is another part of the story that leads to all those different states.
Oh, and I believe you had something to show the audience regarding,
Well, I wanted to give you a map, but you have let me share my screen with you,
yeah,
of what the Ottoman Empire looked like, just because I know it's not going to be familiar to all of our viewers. Hold on one second. So you should see now a map of the Ottoman Empire in 1914. And you can see, I'll move my cursor around the frontiers. The Ottoman Empire stretched from its capital in Istanbul or Constantinople, with a little patch of territory in Europe, through
yeah,
all of Anatolian Turkey as we now know it, and then down through the Arab lands. And you can see the map, they've made little dotted lines here. This is Syria, Jordan,
uh,
Palestine, and Iraq,
yeah,
Kuwait, and then down the Gulf states. And this is the Hijaz region, which will be part of Saudi Arabia today, but was where the Sharifs of Mecca, where Mecca and Medina are the
yeah,
holy cities of Islam, are based. So this would be the Ottoman territory at the start of the war. And then when we come to the end of the war in 1920, the partition diplomacy was going to carve that state up into small islands that were going to be then distributed among Britain and France. At this point, by 1920, the Bolshevik seizure of power in the Russian Empire, had taken Russia out of extraterritorial gains. They didn't want anything in Ottoman lands. So it's just Britain and France. And
Yeah.
here, the Arab lands, Syria and Lebanon, go to France,
Hmm.
Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan go to Britain. But look what
Yeah.
happens to the territory of Turkey itself. It's divided into an Armenian state
Yeah.
with architecture for its independence, a Kurdish state down around Diyarbakir,
Yeah.
a French zone, an Italian zone, in
Yeah.
dark blue given to Greece, and internationalized zones through the strategic waterways of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, reducing the Ottoman Empire to a kind of regency over Istanbul and a rump of territory in Anatolian Turkey that basically no European power wanted. And that was the reality of the
Yeah.
Treaty of Sèvres that I
Yeah.
argue in my book is really going to provoke the fall of the Ottomans. Even more than losing the war, it was signing the peace that was going to
Yeah.
provoke the end of the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah. And I think this treaty and other treaties ending the First World War were, responsible for a lot of other conflicts that happened again in the rest of the 20th century, whether it's the Second World War and, like continuing even into the 21st, with the Arab Spring, etc. I think your book was very timely. It followed close on the heels of the Arab Spring.
Yeah, I don't know whether to count that as good fortune or a curse, considering what the Arab Spring has taken of the high hopes of the demonstrators
Right.
and then the terrible situation we're in today. But
Right.
yes, cynically, as an author, to see book sales reflected in that was my good fortune.
Yeah, true, true. And do you think, like, honestly, with maybe, some hindsight, reading history now, that do you think with the Arab Spring, etc., there was any hope of them, of that whole movement going in the right direction? Because we've seen ever since these treaties and the splitting of the Ottoman Empire, it's gone largely into the hands of strongmen. And it hasn't really been maybe democratic or progressive or representative of the people. Do you think there was any way it could have had a different fate, or could maybe even in the future?
You know, it's a similar situation to what I described in the Ottoman Empire, in that in each of the nation states of the Arab world, it was forbidden to talk opposition politics. And the
Yeah.
most outspoken of the opposition movements has always been the Muslim Brotherhood. And they've gone from periods of deep repression to quiet tolerance by the state. And every time they got too assertive, then they'd be suppressed again. But opposition politics was always life threatening, and those who engaged in it went to jail. So
True.
it was difficult for people in the Arab countries that had been under long ruling autocrats to put forward a kind of political vision for what they wanted after they forced the fall of the dictator. I
Yeah.
think it was entirely legitimate to be demanding a new social contract, to be
Yeah.
demanding accountable government, to have the government serve the people rather than the people fear the government. And these were
Yeah.
things about the Arab Spring that I was totally enthusiastic about. I saw it as
True.
fulfilling the legitimate aspirations of the Arab people to be free people again.
Yeah.
But they
Yeah.
didn't
True.
have a plan for the day after Mubarak fell, or Ben Ali fell, or Ali Abdullah Saleh fell.
Yeah.
And the day after created a power vacuum. And it
Yeah.
turns out that people with ideas are not as effective in power vacuums as people with guns. And the region
True.
now is militarized and violent in a way that it was not before 2011, which is the
True.
tragic phase we're in now.
And unfortunately, I think this entire thing again feeds into the idea that you shouldn't try this again. Don't try this at home. Don't try this in your country, because it just becomes worse if you should just let the strong man rule, because otherwise it's even worse. So
Right.
I think that kind of becomes a sort of tragic epilogue that nobody saw. So I think we have a question, that's enlightenment and reformation never reached the Ottomans because they put themselves into an intellectual quarantine against the West, technological advancement, and scientific innovation. Banning printing press was one of the many problems. Any comments on this?
But I don't think that anybody could really isolate themselves from the new ideas that were emanating from a very powerful Europe in the 19th century. And the Ottomans, they were forced to engage. The printing
Yeah.
press, They had already brought to the Ottoman Empire at the end of the 18th century. And what the government then tried to do was dominate the printing press. They would do that either by publishing things in the name of the government,
True,
or else
exactly.
by giving a government subsidy to newspapers. And then newspapers couldn't publish critical things. If they did, the government would remove the subsidy. But I think in my writing of this history, and this is more relevant to my earlier book, The Arabs, than to the fall of the Ottomans, I see the Ottoman Empire playing a very important role in mediating between European ideas of the Enlightenment and technologies of the Industrial Revolution and the peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean. There is a kind of translation of modernity that the Ottomans are central in that was to really change the Eastern Mediterranean in the course of the 19th century. So, with respect to the questioner, and it's a very interesting way of framing the history, I would argue that you could not build a firewall against new ideas. And it was probably the Ottomans' goal to control that process uh, and to harness it to preserving their state, but not to prevent it from entering Ottoman domains.
Yeah, true. And honestly, I think I found it fascinating. I remember when I went to Istanbul, the Dolmabahce Palace. Honestly, when you go into that palace, you have no way of knowing whether you are in, Turkey, or maybe in one of the Portuguese palaces, in Keluz Palace or anything. The interiors, the Baroque, the Enlightenment influences are very much there. So honestly, I think even while being called the sick man of Europe and, a dying empire, Turkey was, I think, trying to show the rest of Europe how they still fit in through their architecture, even rather than just blocking it and finding another Ottoman so-called identity. I think it was somewhat still a part of Europe even back then.
No, I think that's true. And in many ways, that comes into the story of the First World War experience, because immediately after the Ottoman government signs the Treaty at Sèvres, giving away so much of their territory, you saw the Kemalist movement, the nationalist movement based in Ankara, reject both the Treaty of Sèvres and the Ottoman government. And they are able to prosecute a war of independence over the next 2 years that would see them go to Lausanne in 1923 and sign a new treaty with the victorious states, unlike
Yeah,
Germany and Austria, whose draconian peace treaties would be the cause of the Second World War.
exactly,
If you like,
exactly.
Turkey came through its modernization experience of the
Yeah,
19th and 20th century and was able to complete its national territory and
yeah,
then go back to the victorious powers and assert their claim
true,
to self-determination. And
true.
in that sense, they were able to satisfy their place in the world better than any other defeated country in the First World War.
Exactly. And do you think, like, in modern day Turkey, because whenever you go or you hear people, they always talk about how Turkey right now is very, accepting towards its minorities, and there isn't any discrimination. Generally, that was, I think, maybe even 10 years ago, that was the general impression. But now, in recent days, there has been talk of how the Hagia Sophia is going to be converted back into a mosque. So, what's your opinion on that?
Well, I think there are two different points there. And the first is whether Turkey has been tolerant of difference. And I
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
think the record for Turkey is particularly strong here.
Mm-hmm.
During the First World War, the greatest stain on the Ottoman War record was
Of
the
course.
genocide against Christian communities, first and foremost the Armenians, but
Yeah,
also the Assyrian community.
yeah,
So they had achieved a degree of homogeneity through mass killings that is the very opposite of tolerance.
yeah.
And then, even after consolidating their territory, the largest minority community was the Kurdish community. And the moment the
True.
Kurdish community began to assert a cultural identity different from the Turkish members of the Turkish Republic, they found themselves running into state repression, which continues down to the present. It's, to me, inexplicable how the Prime Minister Erdogan, who had demonstrated his ability to use diplomacy to resolve the differences between Kurds and Turks so effectively, could become the President Erdogan who would lead his country into a war against its own Kurdish population. I, I so wish that he could have built on his accomplishments instead of
Yeah,
being the architect of his own legacy being destroyed. But this is the contradiction of Erdogan and perhaps the problem of staying in power for too long. But when it comes to Hagia Sophia,
Yeah,
this
yeah.
is pure populist politics. Personally, I'm not offended or upset by this measure. Most of the great mosques that we visit when we go to Istanbul are operating as mosques. If you go to the Blue Mosque right next to the Hagia Sophia, or if you go to the Selimiye in Istanbul or in these are mosques, and you must leave in prayer time to allow people to pray, and then it's reopened for people to visit. And I can imagine Hagia Sophia falling into that regime again. So
Yeah.
if they preserve the interior as it is, don't try and cover the mosaics again, then but between the two of us, Madiha, it's not a good mosque now. I mean, I think having icons of Jesus and Mary and mosaics on the walls around you is very much against Islamic principle. And I can't
Yeah.
imagine it being a comfortable place of worship for believing Muslims. So
True,
we can
true.
only see it as a kind of populist politics.
Exactly, and it's going to be a conflict between your restoration, how they're still trying to restore. Because I think I went right now in March, thanks to the pandemic, we had to run. So I was only there for like 3 days or something. But I remember even with those Byzantine mosaics, and they're still, working so hard to restore them. So I think even for this themselves, it's going to be a real pain covering them up again or finding some way into turning it into a mosque, like you said. Uh, making it fit for prayer again. So there is that
Let's
as
see what
well.
they do. I mean, they're promising not to in any way affect the fabric, the material fabric of the mosque.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
if that's what they do, and they want to close it at prayer time for worship, then I see nothing wrong with that. But if, in order to make it more comfortable for Muslims to pray, they then begin to undo the restoration
yeah,
work,
yeah.
then it's an act of violence against what the building was originally
Absolutely,
built as. So
absolutely.
the
So
museum was a neutral status. You have all the
yeah,
signs for the rightly guided caliphs hanging for the walls. You have behind that the mosaics.
exactly,
It worked.
exactly. So we have another. Oh, we have two questions. Do you think
Amazing.
that as Turkey moves away from its secular republic under Erdogan, it could assume its past leadership of the Muslim world? Any thoughts on this? Loving the talk by the professor. So there's a compliment as well.
I'm honored. Thank you so much. I don't see Turkey being able to resume that role that it gave up under Ataturk, of being the kind of focus of the global ummah's religious observance.
But
The
was
aim.
it really? Was it really a focus even then? Because with the Sultan assuming the role of the Caliph all of a sudden, even then, because even in the book you've mentioned how the British army going to attack the Ottomans was for a large part made of Muslims, the ones from India, and then in the same place, because we've read it, especially with the Khilafat movement, etc. There are Muslims who are willing to leave their homeland over here as well, over talk of ending the caliphate. So there was this dichotomy even then. So even the leadership, but obviously up to you.
No, I
Please
mean,
go on.
look, I agree with what you're saying, Madiha. I think that's all correct. And if you like, I think the growth and diversity of the Ummah made it no longer a body of people that was looking for a single leader as a
True.
khilafah. I think, if you like, the idea had passed out of relevance, it was out of time.
Mm-hmm.
And there were certainly communities that objected to Ataturk unilaterally abolishing the khilafah.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
it didn't have, if you like, long lasting resonance. And even today, when you have, Daesh or the ISIS movement trying to lay claim to Khilafah, it doesn't
yeah.
appeal broadly. Most people are very uncomfortable with that
True.
kind of self declared, who
Yeah, and
elected you are Khalifa.
exactly. And I think a lot of splinter groups come up with this banner because I think there might be some outfits even operating in Britain. I think Taliban claimed to do the same thing. Al Qaeda claimed to do the same thing. So even with the Khilafah, you've got so many other versions, so many caliphs maybe to choose from. So I think people are like, just let us get on with what we have right now.
Yeah.
True. Yeah. So another question is how contemporary dramatic history is taking precedence over written history. Don't you think contemporary media forms like Netflix play a significant role in resurrection?
It's funny. I think that the television and cinema has a way of making history very immediate and very approachable. And while historians will complain that they're taking liberties with the historical record or it didn't actually work that way, I'm much more forgiving because anything that makes people interested in the past and love the historic
True.
account will drive them to find the truth or will drive them to ask more questions. So I think it's a very positive development and they reinforce each other. The popular historical narrative and then the professional historical narrative. Who knows? You watch Netflix and then you read my books. I love it.
Exactly, exactly. That's what I was going to say. I think popular history leads to maybe more serious interest in history as well. I remember I was telling some of my students recently because I've been teaching, and I was telling them, I was trying to explain Marxism and the British class system, and they weren't getting it. I'm like, please go and see Downton Abbey, all 6 seasons, then come back. We'll discuss. So yes, I do see the uses of popular history because I love that show, and I keep using movies and series to explain things. Please go and see that, then come back. So yes,
Definitely.
that is true. So another question is: Kemalism legitimized the army to intervene whenever any ruler tries to exploit religion and use it for his interest, which is protected by the constitution. Erdogan is abruptly rolling back Kemalism. In light of that, do you think the Golan revolt was good for the resumption of Kemalism, which everybody failed to see?
Again, I think that we're witnessing now a kind of counter Kemalist revolution in Turkey. I remember when I first began visiting Turkey in the 1980s, having a sense that Kemalism was, in its own sense, too absolute and was too intolerant of people's wish to integrate their religious life into public life. Coming from the Arab world, it was really striking. And if you questioned Kemalism in any way, your Turkish
Mhm.
hosts would think that was very rude. And
Okay, yeah,
if you made jokes about Mustafa Kemal or Ataturk or anything like that, this was the kind of Western bad taste that they frowned on.
yeah.
So I thought it was healthy to see a kind of reassertion of the Islamic culture of Turkey, not to completely overturn the secularism of Ataturk,
Mhm.
but to modify it and bring it more in line with the national culture of all Turks.
True.
Similarly, I think where Erdogan is gone is too extreme.
Mhm.
And I think that he's trying to Islamize Turkish culture. At the same time, he's taking a kind of neoliberal approach to its economy in a way which is undermining of Turkey and of Islam. And I
True.
think, it's something that will be challenged. And I think Turkey moving forward is going to be shaped by these two Manichaean opposites of Kemalism and Erdoganism. But I don't think it's going to statically stay one way or the other. I think that the cities like Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir will always be looking for the kind of liberties that they associate with the secular age, where Anatolia is going to really be looking for the respect for values that so propelled Erdogan to the front of Turkish politics.
And I was going to ask that as well. With Erdogan's, switch slightly towards a more conservative approach, do you think it comes more from a personal perspective, or is it a reflection of the general people's will or their general taste in moving towards a more traditional approach?
I think it's a combination of both. And I think we have to respect how successful a leader Erdogan has been for so much of his time in office. And this accounts for his appeal to voters. It was past, 5 or 6, and now he's been in too long, doesn't have the answers, and is going against the values of people. So in those ways, I think there will be change.
Yeah. Okay, again, I think related to this question as well, what's your take on the secularism debate? Do you ascribe to perspectives like Talal Assad's, or do you think there's a different, truly neutral form of secularism out there? Out there, but yeah.
I don't believe there's a truly neutral anything out there. As I said before, I think we bring our biases and our baggage to any ideology. I have always believed that you
Sure.
could bring Islam and democracy into harmony with each other. And I have argued for a long time against this idea that only secularism provided a stable future. But I must say that the growing intolerance, even within the Muslim community, makes me question whether it is not better to separate religion and politics. Because those
Yeah,
parties that see it as a religious duty to stay in power and make the
exactly.
law will undermine the scope for those they disagree with to replace them. And without opposition, no democracy. So I've come to
That was going to
question,
be my last. Yeah, yeah, of course.
say it
Go on,
again.
go on, go on. I
No,
think
it's
my
just, it's,
internet is catching up as well. Yeah.
yeah, mine's acting up a bit too. So,
Yeah.
but anyway, no, I would say I'm much more in line with Talal Assad's view, though I haven't always been there. It's really a reflection of the past 10 years and what's happened to regional politics and the very divisive role that people have used Islam to play in
Yeah,
making.
exactly. Exactly. Okay, wherever there's talk of Islam, someone maybe hijacks it. Might be a strong word, but generally the users it's put to might not be in line with everyone's view of religion itself. So yes.
Yeah,
So yes, last comments. Thank you so much, Eugene. I don't think there are any more questions, but it's been lovely having you, and we really hope that this pandemic and everything clears up, and we can see you here in Lahore very soon.
I cannot wait to come back, Madihan. Thank you again, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. It's been such a pleasure getting to speak with you and with the audience. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Bye bye.